Welcome to another riveting lesson. This is section 2.2, Interactions Among Species, continuing on in chapter 2. Please remember to continue defining your key terms as we go through. Look for words that are underlined with definitions. Remember videos, YouTube. These YouTube videos will be in my ecology playlist. Okay, a new term to talk about is ecological niche. I believe that is pronounced niche. Sometimes you can hear it pronounced niche. If you say niche, especially in like the context of this biology, then people will know what you're talking about. What is it? It's the role of an organism in an ecosystem. It's basically a really easy way to think about it is of an organism's like job. And if you have a part-time job, you notice that two people usually don't have the same job, right? Because why would you get two people to do the same thing? You're going to get in each other's way. It's inefficient. So these ecological niches are roles that organisms take in ecosystems, and usually like one or like a population of one or like a community of one type of organism will occupy this niche. It's not to say that like there's a singular organism in the entire forest that's going to do this one job, but there could be multiple like ravens that would do one thing, or there's a bunch of bats, or there's a bunch of insects of some type, right? So that's sort of the thing there. So basically, but the niche here, we can get down to the organism level to see how that particular organism interacts. Because when we're talking about population dynamics, that's a bit beyond the scope of this level because we're just grade 9. But you can look at how populations interact with their environment, but we don't need to. So we'll be an organism. But I just wanted to point out that it's not like there's only one organism, obviously, in this entire ecosystem. So the niche includes the resources used, the food that it's eating, the abiotic factors that limit its survival, biotic relationships that it has with other species. Those are all part of the niche of the organism. So a brown bat, right? That ecological niche will include what it eats. So it eats. So the biotic factors, right, are what it eats. You notice, right? So insects are living things, hence they are biotic. The competitors, which we're going to talk about because this is competition, another biotic interaction, which we're going to talk about later in this lesson. So maybe a nighthawk is going to also eat insects. So the bat and this hawk are going to be competing for that resource. Or whatever eats the bat, right? The living things that are going to try and eat that bat, those are biotic factors, right? Because they can limit the amount of brown bats that there are, as well as certain abiotic factors, these non-living things, like the places that it uses for hibernation, where it sleeps for a long time, the time of night that it hunts for food, airspace it flies through, and the temperature range that it can tolerate. All of those things are non-living, and they affect both the ability of the organism to reproduce, right? So they are limiting factors, but they also contribute to they're also part of the niche of the brown bat, the brown bat's sort of role or its job. So different species provide different services to their ecosystems by occupying their ecological niches. The service provided by bats is the regulation of insect populations. Bats are actually very good to have around for that reason. If you don't like mosquitoes, which I believe no one does, bats eat a lot of mosquitoes, especially these little brown bats. That's the name of the organism is called little brown bat. There's some in Ontario. I think that's probably the most common species of bat around here. And like I said, they eat insects. So if there are bats around around the outside of your house is good. Obviously, bats inside your house is not a good thing, but you can get them removed safely without harming the bats. Bats obviously inside is really bad because their droppings contain lots of contagious diseases and stuff, right? So you don't want them living with you, but a bat living in its own sort of ecosystem outside your house, but near to your house, is not a bad thing because, like I said, they're going to eat those pesky mosquitoes, which is nice. So no two species can occupy the same niche because no two species live the same way, right? So they don't have the same job. No two different species don't have the same job. If their niches overlap, then that leads to competition, like we see with these bats and hawks and a bunch of different organisms, obviously. Okay, let's talk about this biotic interaction of predation and how it affects population size. So a predator is described as an organism that kills and consumes other organisms for food, right? And the prey is an organism that is eaten by the predator, right? So predator and prey, two words which you might already have been familiar with, but we have a more biological definition for them here. So lynx is it's like a mountain cat, just like a large cat, smaller than a tiger, larger than your pet cat. I think lynx, yeah, they are. Anyways, sorry. And they will eat snowshoe hares, or basically rabbits, right? So the lynx is the predator, and then like the hare or the rabbit is the prey. And there's two ways that these interactions can influence population size. We have what's called bottom-up population regulation, and then there is top-down. This slide is actually pretty important. It can be, I noticed last semester, maybe a little bit confusing for some people, so maybe keep an eye on this slide. Bottom-up population regulation. So an example of that is a shortage of prey causing a decline in the population of the predator. So if you think about it, we have the prey on the bottom, right, and then being eaten by the predator on the top, right? But if we have a shortage of prey on the bottom, it will affect how many we have sort of on the top. If you're viewing it like this, right? So what that means, if the rabbits go away, then the lynxes are going to start to die, right? So if anything affects the population of the prey, it will affect the population of the predator. This is called bottom up. Sort of like you're affecting the thing at the bottom of the chain, and it affects the thing at the top of the chain. Because we're going to talk about food chains a little bit, but that's sort of part of where this comes from, right? So as the number of hares decrease, the number of lynx will decrease as well. So we see that they're connected, right? The predator and its prey, their population sizes are connected. Then there's the other one is called top-down population regulation. So from top down, right, we have the same situation of, sorry, just because it takes me too long to draw, I have to just draw circles. Right, with the same thing, we have the prey being eaten by the predator, but an increase in the population of the predator will cause a decline in the population of the prey. So if the predator population increases, it creates like a feedback loop, right, because these guys, or hang on a second, we see that if the number of the predator goes up, then we see increased consumption of the prey, which means that eventually the prey population will decrease, right? Will go sort of down. I'm using all these arrows. I hope that this is helpful, not super misleading. But basically, then it works sort of the opposite way. If there is a lot of lynx, for whatever reason, then they're going to eat more hares, which will decrease the hare population, right? And that's called top-down population regulation, sort of like affecting the predator. Sorry, something that affects the predator population size will eventually affect the prey population size. Okay, so bottom-up and top-down, sort of basically something affecting the prey that will affect the predator population in bottom-up, something that affects the predator that will eventually affect the prey in top-down. Okay, then let's take a look at this graph. This graph is going to be very important, so please just take a quick maybe picture, star, or whatever. This slide here is going to be important, specifically this graph here. So we see a graph of population size of lynx and snowshoe hares on the same axes. The rise and fall of populations occurs about every 10 years, so there's a fluctuation. The prey numbers are always greater than the predator numbers, right? Which makes sense, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, I think, when we talk about energy transfer in these ecosystems. And so let's take a look at this graph in detail because it's going to be important. We see snowshoe hare population on the left, y-axis, right? Notice that it's like 160,000, quite large numbers. The lynx population on the right-hand side, also on the y-axis. Notice that we have two different y-axes here, right? Or we have two different scales because this is 9,000. So if you look, these are going up by 3,000s, whereas these are going up by 40,000. So the scale is completely different, but they can be on the same axis, right? Because that can still be beneficial because, look, we can notice a trend in the graph. Year on the x-axis is just the same going from left to right, increase, right? So you notice that, like, and then we have our numbers to distinguish between the two, right? So these are line graphs, the lynx in red and snowshoe hare in blue. So the snowshoe hare, the blue lines, we look at the numbers on the left, right? The red lines, we look at the numbers on the right. So this peak here for red, we line it up, it's just over 3,000-ish, I don't know, right, roughly. Whereas at around the same time, so let's say 1850, around the same time, for the blue line, we connect it to the left here. So we see that it's below 40,000, maybe about, I don't know, midway, so about 20,000 snowshoe hares. At that time, right? See how that works? So blue on the left, red to the right, and that's how we can read that graph, the graph at the time. Let's look at the pattern though. So the blue line is always bigger, which makes sense because that's the prey. And the pattern or trend in the graph is we see that whenever there's a peak of prey, we usually see that it comes shortly after a trough or a dip in the red line, right? So as the lynx population decreases just after 1850 down here, we see that the snowshoe hare population reaches a peak, right? Which makes sense. If there's not a lot of predators, so like if, sorry, oh God, this line down here, if there, can I draw a straight line? I don't know. If we, looking at this time right here, my terrible line, I'll change the color of the pen. I think pen color, let's make it black. Be easier to see, I think. So if we sort of try and line it up as best as I possibly can, you notice that the dip, the lynx population is down. There's not a lot of lynx. So what does that mean? It means that, oh hey, the hares can reproduce, right? The number of hares getting eaten will be lower because there's less lynx. So their birth rate will go up, their carrying capacity can probably increase, right? So we see that there's an increase, there's a little top point. But then the inevitable thing that's going to happen is when there's this peak right here, we notice that it's associated with a dip. And there's a huge dip right around here, shortly after this peak of the lynx. So the lynx have a spike because there's lots of hares available, lots of food around. If there's lots of food around, that means that we can have more lynx, right? We can have more lynx being born. If the lynx population increases, we're going to notice a decrease in the population of the hares, right? Because if there's more predators, they're going to eat more of the prey. But what happens? The population of lynx will also decline around this point here, leading to an explosion of hares shortly afterwards. So you'll notice that every time that there's a dip in the red line, the blue line starts to shoot up, but then as the blue line starts to go up, the red line starts to go up again. And then that leads to a decrease or a dip in the blue line, right? More or less staggered for this. Now this is real world data, so it's not going to be perfect, but you can sort of see this overall trend. Right, that as one goes up, the other one will also, as one changes, the other one will change also, right? Just like we talked about with our bottom up or our top down. So if there's a reason, so if there's a huge dip, like we see down here in the hare, bottom up regulation, there's also going to be a dip in the red, right, in the predator population. But then the same thing is that if we see an increase in the lynx, as the lynx population goes up, we notice that there is a decrease associated with the hare population, which is the top-down regulation. So this graph can really show you the two types of regulation occurring for predator-prey, called a predator-prey cycle. let's talk about the biotic interaction that's called competition. Like I said, if two niches overlap, then organisms can compete for the same resource. Sort of like they're going to fight over stuff. Like if you and your sibling are fighting over like the last like cookie or whatever, you know what I mean? So competition occurs when two or more organisms compete for the same resource, such as food or space, right? The competition can limit the size of a population. It can also influence the ecological niche of an organism, right? So, for example, as the size of a population of female song sparrows, right, type of bird, increases, the average number of eggs laid decreases. So why does that happen? Well, the competition for food between the song sparrows leads to a decline in the reproductive output of these birds. There's not enough food to support the production of eggs. So, organisms compete. Organisms, even in the same species, can compete because they're obviously all going for the same resources, right? They're looking for the same mates and stuff. That's why maybe even in birds, like you see mating displays, peacocks are a really good example of that. There's competition in there, right? You can see not male lions, sorry, you can see male like elk fight each other. Often for territory or probably also to find mates, right? So this is all competition, looking for resources. We can see that even in these birds, if there is lots of these birds, there's going to be more competition. If there's more competition, then certain organisms are less successful in reproducing, right? Which is sort of, it's sad, but that's the way nature works, right? Fighting over resources is competition. Let's talk about another biotic interaction. We're going to shift gears just a little bit. We're going to talk about symbiosis. Symbiosis has multiple types, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. But symbiosis is defined as the interaction between two different species that live together in a close association, right? That seems very, very vague. But some of the key things is that they have to be different species. And basically, it's two organisms kind of using the same resources but not in competition. So you see a bit of a difference, right? Competition is that these organisms are fighting, and they can be the same. They can be the same species in competition, but in symbiosis, it's two organisms that are going to be basically using the same resources. And there's a couple different kind of outcomes from that, and basically meaning that there's different types of symbiosis. So the broad sense, you might have heard this term symbiosis if you've seen that movie Venom. Came out like a year or two ago with Tom Hardy in it. It's like a comic book movie. But if you've seen it, or if you know anything about it, or know anything about that character, then the alien, it's about aliens. The alien is referred to as an alien symbiote, right? And it needs what's called a host, specifically humans, right? So it needs humans to survive. But it's its own. It's an organism. It's an alien being, but it needs the human body in order for it to survive. So that's just an example of symbiosis. Now, one of the types of symbiosis we're going to talk about is called mutualism, right? What that means is it's a symbiotic relationship, right, between two species in which both species benefit from the relationship. So both of these species are using the same resources, but we're not competing. Both organisms can use the same resource effectively and actually beneficially. So an example of that, algae living inside tropical reef-building coral, right? The algae provide the coral with energy, and the coral provides the algae with protection, right, from predators and stuff. With protection from predators, as well as nutrients and carbon dioxide. So both the algae and the coral mutually benefit from the interaction. Another example are pilot fish and sharks. So these two organisms need each other to survive, and in the mutualism example of symbiosis, the algae and the coral both are benefiting. Same thing with pilot fish and sharks. I believe those are the fish that stick to the side of sharks as sharks. So the shark looks for food, and then shark finds food, eats food. There's going to be little bits left over. I believe that the pilot fish eat those little bits. So the pilot fish are stuck to the outside of the shark, but ultimately the shark, I think, is not harmed, and neither are the pilot fish, right? Another example of mutualism is crocodiles and those birds that eat this, that peck the teeth. If you've ever seen that, my question when I was younger is why doesn't it just eat the bird? And it's because that there's a mutualistic, or there's a relationship there, a symbiotic relationship there, that that crocodiles, I don't know which one. I believe it's both types, but they're very different animals. But once a crocodile or alligator eats something, it's going to get a lot of food stuck between its teeth, and obviously without access to a toothbrush or floss, that the food that flesh is going to decay in there. Right now, it's not too much of an issue because that's a big problem for predators. But you see that these birds can actually come in and start picking off some of that dead flesh, which is kind of gross. But the birds get to eat, right? The birds don't have to hunt for the food. They get food right there. But it does clean the alligator's mouth, which is beneficial because it doesn't want to get stuff stuck in there. And it doesn't take as much effort on the alligator's part. Like, its body doesn't have to, its immune system doesn't have to work as hard because of all these toxins sort of getting in there because of the decaying flesh. So there's a benefit there. So both organisms are benefiting. The bird gets some food, and then the alligator gets its teeth cleaned, and that's why it doesn't eat that bird. Now, it's not to say that it won't, right? There's always like a risk inherently in there, and if the alligator so chooses. But there's sort of like an instinctual thing in there that both organisms sort of are realizing that there's a benefit, right? So even like a predator can exist in a mutualistic relationship with what would seem like prey, but because that bird occupies that niche and eats that thing, then it kind of provides safety, right? Another example of symbiosis is called parasitism. Hopefully you're not familiar with it, but you might know the term. I hope that you haven't experienced this, or no one you know has experienced this. But parasitism is the relationship in which a parasite's niche is dependent on a close association with a larger host organism. Or basically that it's a symbiotic relationship in which one organism benefits, but the other organism does not. So the other organism is actually harmed in a parasitic symbiotic relationship. So looking at brainworm parasites, brainworms are parasites to the white-tailed deer and moose. White-tailed deer can tolerate brainworms, so the parasites do not have significant effects on the white-tailed deer. But if moose are infected, then they suffer from moose disease, which is a degenerative condition characterized by stumbling movements, confusion, and eventually death. Right? So you can really see that, okay, there's the moose and the brainworm are interacting. The brainworm is getting something out of this relationship, right? The brainworm is getting the resources that it needs. But what's happening to the poor moose? The moose is eventually going to die, right? So that's symbiosis, one organism benefiting while the other one is harmed. Another example of this, and we refer to the organism that's harmful as the parasite. So that's what that term means, right? And the other organism is referred to as the host. So the one that's being harmed is usually referred to as a host. Another example is tapeworm. Tapeworms can affect humans as well as animals, obviously. So by eating contaminated water, drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food, you can get a tapeworm into your body. What happens there is that if the organism, the host that gets the tapeworm, can eat a bunch of food, but the tapeworm will absorb all of those nutrients. And so the host does not get any of the benefits of the food that it eats, right? So see how this works? It's sort of not ingenious, but it's an interesting way that life has developed in order for one organism to sort of use another one. So if I have a tapeworm, I'm the one that's doing all the work getting all this food. The tapeworm just is along for the ride and doesn't really have to do a whole lot, right? So not very nice. And what will happen is the host in a tapeworm will actually lose a lot of weight and will get and will have very negative health effects due to this, right? Now, fortunately, I think that you just take some antibiotics that will kill a tapeworm. So they're very treatable. It's serious, obviously, so you don't want to get that. And so you hear lots of people that have been on vacation will often go to a place and then they might eat some contaminated food. So the parts of the world are more prone to certain parasites. So obviously if you're going to do any travel, in your travel research, you'll find out stuff like this saying avoid eating certain types of food because you might get parasites. Not as common now because obviously our public health is quite good, but still a risk. Okay, now just for fun, there is a third type of symbiosis. We don't talk about it in this course, so it's not curriculum, so you don't have to know about it. But just to tell you now, it's called commensalism, and it's basically, I think that it's a type of symbiosis where, neither organism benefits or is harmed. So basically, there's like sort of like a net. It's just very neutral, right? So I think that's like sometimes like using the same like nesting space for some organisms that they can, I'm sorry, like a tree, let's say, like a bird making a nest in a tree. It's a type of symbiotic relationship because they're right, like the tree is living, the bird is living, and it makes a nest, and so maybe the tree provides some shade, but in terms of resources used, the bird might not be using resources from the tree. And the tree isn't really harmed, and like the bird isn't really benefited. I could be getting my signals crossed there, but hey, it's not curriculum, so it doesn't matter. But there is a third type of symbiosis, right? Just wanted to point that out, just in case you're interested. Okay, that's it. Talk to you guys soon.